John Doyle has a new video, 9 ideas that will win the conservatives the future. Let's see how this goes. Oh, what a nice lime shirt, John. You gotta love it, right?
So unless you've been living under a rock for the last 5 years, you know that President Trump has unleashed an energized conservative movement that has never been seen before in my lifetime, and perhaps even in any of our lifetimes, and that our...
I would agree. Conservatives are freaking out, and they're super happy that they're hurting a ton of people. Because for some reason that seems like the main goal in their life is to hurt the libs. Very strange.
Success as a civilization is entirely contingent upon our ability and efforts to propagate that movement to and beyond our victory. And I know that we talked a little bit about this before. It's not exactly what we like to hear, but this movement was never meant to succeed. And it's still not meant to succeed. Like, we can talk about the corruption, we can talk about the deep state, all that stuff at a later time.
The deep state, aka boring bureaucrats who've worked in the government for decades. This idea of the fucking deep state is conspiracy nonsense at its worst. It's tied into a lot of that QAnon bullshit, too. As far as I know, John isn't into, like, QAnon, but it wouldn't shock me if he was behind closed doors. Like, stop with this deep state stuff. There isn't this secret cabal of people working to, like, destroy the government that they work in. And if there are, they're called Republicans. Look up Starving the Beast.
But the point is that the Washington establishment, including the Republican establishment and the ruling class, they all want to return to business as usual. They're going to do literally everything in their power to make sure, well, something like Donald Trump can never happen again. That's how they're going to put it. You know, we're going to see.
That would be awesome, because Donald Trump, we're very lucky that Donald Trump is a dumb fascist. Like, don't get me wrong, he's caused tons of damage that's gonna take decades to fix, to even get back to parity with where we were prior to his election. But nonetheless, it could be worse. Like, if Steve Bannon had been elected president, for instance, I feel like we would have been in even more trouble. Because Steve Bannon is also a fascist, but he's smart. Donald Trump is a fascist who's just a fascist by the fact of him being stupid, and other people like Steve Bannon using Donald Trump as a frontman to further these far-right extremist goals, right? So, we're pretty lucky the actual president's an idiot.
So-called principled conservatives talking about restoring true conservative values to the GOP. And I predict that the left might even take it easy on them to try to give the illusion of being reasonable and to turn everyone against the true threat, which is the authentic conservative movement ignited by Donald Trump. That's why we have to demand, not...
I would agree that Donald Trump is an authentic conservative and that he goes full mask off. That doesn't make that a good thing, right? Donald Trump embodies everything that the Republicans have talked about behind closed doors for decades. Openly fucking racist. Openly hateful of outsiders, which ties into the racism. Disdain for the poor. Not caring about government services and trying to destroy them because they're rich and they don't understand what they're there for. Absolute uncaring for the working class, which ties into disdain for the poor. No empathy, nothing of value, right? This is the Republican Party, and this is conservatism, and I agree. But, like, can we not pretend like Donald Trump is that different from your typical Republican? He just says the quiet part out loud.
Not just ask, demand that our representatives conform to the ideas of that movement. We don't want the true conservative values that have allowed for the left to completely take over our culture, while fake Washington conservatives make millions of dollars assuring us that our freedoms and way of life are actually under attack.
The reason the left has won the culture war, or has been for a very long time, John, isn't due to complacency among conservatives. Conservatives have consistently pushed against progress for decades and decades and decades, and the reason that they continually fail is, as it turns out, on the whole, most people in society have empathy and the ability to understand that when other people come to them and say, hey, this is my lived experience, I would like to have rights, please stop treating me like a subhuman, most people who are not psychopaths will decide, you know what, yeah, that sounds good. And that's how we've continually gained progress on things like gender equality, on things like trying to make racism not disappear, but make it not socially acceptable, right? Why we've made progress on gay rights, why we've made progress on trans rights, because as it turns out, well, there are a ton of people in power and people like you, John, who seem to have no empathy for anyone. Most people do, and you are in the minority there, right? If you have disdain for the people around you and you just want to make sure that everything works out for you and no one else matters and you don't care about the general welfare of society and all you care about is how much money you have in the bank or how much power you can accrue, you are in the minority, right? Fuck you.
1,000 miles away from our shores, so we have to go send young men to die while they profit from it. If that pathetic, impotent breed of conservatism were of any use, our public debates would be over cool stuff like, hey, let's lower the age to purchase fully automatic LMGs to 16, but instead, we're just
I think it says a lot about John that that's the first thing he thinks of. Oh, should we talk about providing health care to people or opening up education so people can get well-paying jobs and increase the welfare of our society? No, let's let minors buy machine guns. Genius. I always wanted Columbine 2.0 to happen, but to be much, much bloodier. Seems like that's what John's going for. Sort of a Columbine speed run.
begging to hold on to magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, begging to not have our children indoctrinated into questioning their gender identity, begging, just begging.
John, okay, let's take these things one at a time. First of all, in what circumstance, when you have a rifle, whether it be, I'm assuming in this case it's a semi-automatic that you're talking about, right? Because you have 10 rounds, and if you had an automatic rifle, first of all, those are incredibly expensive, and second of all, you need more than 10 rounds for something like that, typically. In what case do you need to fire more than 10 rounds as rapidly as you can pull the trigger? Outside of a mass shooting, in what scenario do you need to fire more than 10 rounds before you change your clip, before you add more ammo to your gun? I can think of 0 situations, and if your only answer is, because I can, that's not a good answer. It's not a good answer. The Constitution says that we have the right to make sure that we have well-regulated gun laws. It's right there in the Second Amendment. And just saying I want it because I think it's cool isn't a good reason. Secondly, the trans thing. No one's forcing kids to be trans. Believe me, not the case. Am trans. No one forced me to be trans. Quite the opposite. Society really, really, really doesn't like trans people. Especially people like you. So, kids are not being coerced into questioning their gender identity. It's just something that is socially acceptable. So, like, for instance, if I grew up today instead of growing up in the 90s, before you were born, John, because you were born in 1999 or something like that. The great John Doyle, born in 1999, 21 years old, is going to school us on politics. Maybe I would have turned out less depressed, let's say, if I had been allowed to start transitioning younger, or if I were allowed to go on puberty blockers at a younger age to try and stop me from going through certain bodily changes that are going to be impossible to undo without surgical intervention. Does John go to college? No, he does not go to college. He works at Subway, he lives at his parents' house, and he makes this show. So, very, very silly.
To not be totally crushed by the left. You know who begs? Losers. That's how much ground we've lost. And this isn't to depress you, it's to invigorate you so we can get our act together and start to actually win. Because we've lost too much ground to just sit back and do nothing. We can't allow our country to return to business as usual, which just means Republicans sitting back and doing nothing except profiting off our misguided trust while the left destroys our country. We have to carry this.
By the left destroys our country, he means ensures that people have equal rights. Remember, John Doyle in the past has expressly said that he thinks that women shouldn't have the right to vote. So when he's talking about, like, the left allowing, or the left destroying the country, he's talking about people getting rights.
Torch. And so we're going to go over some of the ideas that will help us do that in the future. Very important, so do stay tuned.
John Doyle in Heck Off, Commie.
Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Heck Off Commie. This is your third and final reminder that the long-awaited, much-requested Heck Off Commie Discord server is up and running. It's very epic. It's a lot of fun. So if you want to join that, just go to heckoffcommie.com, get a membership. It's only $4, and then you access a bunch of epic stuff while also supporting the channel. Very cool. Very excited about this one. People who have memberships and keep up with the book recommendations might remember that a couple months ago I recommended this book by my friend Ryan Gerdusky, all about why Donald Trump won the election, what led to it, etc. And so the other night I finally got a chance to start reading it, and he included a bullet point list in the preface of the book with 9 beliefs that best encompass what we're talking about. So definitely pick up a copy of that book. But you might hear some of these and you think to yourself like, yeah, of course, obviously I believe this, and then you might hear others and think, well, now wait a second, I'm not too sure about that. But I'm going to just kind of explain what I think when looking at them, and then I think that you'll find that you actually agree with almost all of them. And also very important to note is that the country agrees with almost all of them, if not all of them, which is why
Donald Trump lost the popular vote by like 3 million votes. What are you talking about? Donald Trump is not popular on the whole. Most people do not like Donald Trump. It's really, really right-wing people and Republicans who fall in line behind whoever has an R next to their name on the ballot who like him. Moderates and people on the left really don't like Donald Trump. Even most centrists don't like Donald Trump because he's such a douche.
these are things that conservatives really need to nail into the minds of the public if we want to be successful in the future. Not only because they're appealing, right? But because they're true and because they will make our lives better. It's one thing to tell voters what they want to hear, oh, hey, free stuff. But it's another thing to tell them things that they want to hear.
Tell them what they want to hear, like Donald Trump doing racist dog whistles and yelling, "Build the wall!" that hasn't been built and won't be. You're describing Donald Trump. Don't get me wrong, you're describing a lot of politicians. But to act that Donald Trump is, telling people this, oh, it's a hard truth, but it's the truth. No, he just panders to far-right people, racists, narcissists, and people who don't care about others. That's what he does, and that's why he's been able to energize the right so much. Because underlying a lot of the dog whistly stuff that people on the right have done in the past in terms of, I want to get rid of social services, and I want to whatever, blah, 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 welfare queens, all that kind of crap. Donald Trump just says these things, but without the mask. He just says he thinks that people who are Latino are rapists. He says, that he thinks that, black people should, shut up, basically, and that the cops are doing their job, and that they're good. He calls people who are going to, white nationalist meetings and stuff they're very fine people. The people at Charlottesville, very fine people on both sides. He's just doing the things Republicans have always done, but more blatantly. And a lot of people, it gets their rage boner going. People like you, John.
Because we all know instinctively that they're correct and they're what's best for us as a nation. And so really quickly, I want to point out two things. Firstly, if you look at the way people voted in 2016, you look at where they stand on the issues in comparison to each other and then who they voted for, what we find is that there was a much greater divide between people on social issues, on issues of identity, than there is on economic issues. And I know that people are skeptical of these political compass type models, but this one actually analyzed a dozen specific and different issues and then quantified attitudes from there. So I think it's actually pretty accurate. But what this tells us is that for the time being, the issues that are going to decide our future are social issues. The tug of war is over questions of identity, questions like, what does it mean to be an American? Is America good, and should America be preserved? What do we stand for as a people? Are we proud of what we've done? Are we proud of what we've done as a people? Are we proud of our history? Do we celebrate our history and the people who've dedicated their lives to the service of this country, not only through innovation and conquest, but also through defending its sovereignty?
Innovation and conquest. Innovation, good. Conquest, bad.
Those are the questions that decide the existence and future of a nation. Questions about economic issues are unequivocally downstream from issues of identity. Now is not the time to be debating the free market versus the Department of Energy within the context of efficient allocation of resources, because I can promise you that if we don't take our culture back, none of those issues are going to matter, because we won't even have...
You're not gonna, John. No matter how much you try, you're never going to win the culture war, if you want to call it that. I would consider it more something along the lines of the cultural zeitgeist rather than a culture war, because it implies that people are, actively engaging with it consciously, when in reality I don't think most people are. Fraggle Rock, thank you for following. It's just that every culture has ideals and beliefs and societal understandings of who should have rights and why and what is acceptable within society, the things that we value, all these sorts of things, and this sort of organically changes over time, right? This happens within all cultures, not just the United States. And the right's never going to win. The right will never be able to win this because, A, they're conservative, and conservatives always lose in the long run because conservatism is entirely grounded in the idea that you can stop society where it is, like cryogenically freeze it and keep it right there, which has never been the case in the history of any society on the planet ever. Society has always changed, not only for the better, but it's always changed, right? And on top of that, I think that the reason the right is so bad at actively changing the narratives that we talk about in society in a positive direction, they don't win on things like, again, gay marriage and acceptance of gay people. They don't win on like things like interracial marriage or the ability for, black people to vote or the ability of black people to not be discriminated against for jobs. And the reason they don't win is because, again, they lack that ability to empathize. And most people operate with empathy in their everyday lives. So, people who have empathy are going to be able to relate to people when they say they have problems. And people who understand that and then can organize to get other people to understand it, whether it be through political campaigns, whether through social issue campaigns, something like Black Lives Matter, or back in the 60s with the Civil Rights Movement, or, even earlier than that, like Susan B. Anthony and trying to get suffrage through. All these sorts of things, the right cannot organize in that way. They just can't by definition because they are not collectivist by nature. They're individualistic, right? They might get together every 4 years and be like, let's vote so we can get taxes lowered on us individually. But they have this problem where they can't get together and collectively push messages effectively unless these messages are things that people in their group already believe. Like, Donald Trump is successful in riling up the right by saying things like he thinks, Mexican immigrants are like thieves and rapists and murderers and stuff. But he's not going to effectively be able to convey that message to people who don't already think that. Because it's not an opinion based in reality. It's an opinion based in, like, his xenophobia and his hate and his, like, racism. These are things that you can't reason someone into, right? Because it's not a reasonable position. However, on the left, when you're using empathy, you can reason people into understanding, hey, even though this person is different than you, they're still a human being with feelings, and they deserve rights. And that's something everyone can get behind, and that doesn't even get into the fact that, like, the left, and people will be like, oh, no, that's not the case. Sure, the media and the entertainment industry are gonna lean left, and so is academia. Do you know why? Because in media, for instance, films and TV shows are engines built with empathy, right? Something people on the right are incapable of understanding. So your predominant cultural narratives that are going to come out of things like movies and TV shows are going to be driven by people with empathy. So those narratives are going to become the predominant ones within society. Thank you to MMO Addicted with 100 bits. Imagine in X hundred years the conservatives seeking to preserve a diverse society as neo-fascist progressives seek to introduce a new ruthless corpo state. Ellie Trudgett with 100 bits. Hey, Hannah, you're looking pretty today. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Where was I? Anyway, so the people who sort of tell the stories within our society, and stories are integral to sort of cultural cohesion and cultural belief systems, those people are empathetic. And empathy leads people to the left. Because leftward positions are positions of understanding, collectivism, and helping each other out, whereas right-leaning positions are selfish, uncaring, unempathetic, and self-interested.
Have a country anymore because they are openly calling for the fundamental uprooting of our country to be replaced with their progressive utopia. Like,
hey, John, if people in this country say that it's okay to, like, be trans and gay and all sorts of races and be whoever you are as long as you aren't hurting people, it's still America. It's just a better America. The fact that you think America's only America if it continues to hate and it continues to discriminate, then you have a very low opinion of America.
once we take the culture back, we can focus on all the other things. But right now, that's just not where we should be directing resources.
Take the culture back. I sometimes have people ask in my videos, by the way, on these videos in particular, when I deal with John Doyle. They're like, why do you say John Doyle is a fascist? It's because of stuff like that. Because he's dog whistling. Because fascists don't come out and say, well, we're going to get in charge and we're going to make it illegal for people to be gay or trans or whatever, and if you are, we're going to arrest you and lock you up. What does John mean in this context of we're going to take America back from these leftists who are changing the face of America, other than we're going to forcibly make people conform to our view of what society should be? There's no other meaning, right? It's clear that what he's saying here is, I think America should look like what it looked in 1952, and we are going to make it look like that by force if we have to. That's fascism.
Sources. Like, you're not going to get socialism because they've convinced people that that in itself works. You're going to get it because they've convinced people that America in itself is inherently evil and can only be fixed with their worldview, which includes...
America isn't inherently everything. America is a social construct. It's a country that we all agree on because of our borders exists, and it's constituent of all of the people who live in it. America is not inherently anything. America is descriptive, not prescriptive. So if we're talking about America, depending on the context, more often than not, we're talking about the people who live here. We're talking about the conglomeration of Americans who live here. So you can't say America is inherently one thing or another, right? Whether you think it's a bastion, a shining city on a hill, or whether you think it's a destructive, evil thing, neither is entirely correct. America has a complicated history. America has a history of both people who live within it who fight for justice and equality, and people within it who've done horrible atrocities, committed genocide, racism, inflicted slavery upon people. And America is constantly in this tug of war with itself between the different factions within it. The people on the left who are more empathetic and understanding and try and push for more equality and understanding and try and stop hurting other people, and people on, let's say, the right who don't care and work for their own self-interest and work for often the oppression of people who they don't agree with or people who they feel don't fit into their standard for what should be society, right? America's complicated. It's not one thing or another. What we're talking about is the individuals within it. So I can say things like, wow, America's done a lot of fucked up things. I don't mean America the landmass. I mean people within the country. I mean the people who held slaves, right? I mean the people who pushed Native Americans onto the Trail of Tears and marched them across the country to reservations, and many of them died, right? But, in that same token, there are people like Harriet Tubman, right? Who, in spite of the fact that there was so much against her, still did her best to try and bring certain people to freedom and work towards abolition. People like Abraham Lincoln. You know Abraham Lincoln, John. He was the first Republican. You guys are a long way from that now, aren't ya? It's just wild to me John, that you view this in such a black and white way that you're like, either the liberals will get their way and America will be considered evil, or we'll get our way and we'll say that it's good, so that'll make it good. No. People will and always have defined societies by their actions. So whether or not the left gets into power and we recognize the complicated history of America and try and rectify for the sins of the past while moving forward towards a more enlightened future, or people on the right win and they just deny and say, no, Thomas Jefferson, even though he raped a 14-year-old slave that he owned and owned many other slaves, he's still a great guy, rah rah, USA. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, people are going to look back at America for what it's done, for what we've done, and they're going to judge it on those merits, not whether or not you personally believe that it's good or not.
Socialism and everything else needed to destroy America. And so as we can see in the graphic, the people who voted for Trump, that energized base, we're not energized because we're like, wow, Trump just cited the Laffer curve in a speech. I just get so giddy for tax policy. No, it's because we're like, yes, America will be put first. Shut up, China. Shut up, Europe. Shut up, Mexico. I'm not apologizing for being born in the greatest country on earth anymore.
That's a very mature and adult way of looking at policy, foreign policy, John. I see that your whole 21 years of life have enlightened you to such a level that you think you understand foreign policy better than people who've been in it for literal decades. Genius.
And yes, we actually are going to put our people first once again. That's what got Trump elected, because these are issues that matter to people. They're the most important. And the other thing I wanted to point out really quick, look at Tucker Carlson. He's been breaking all-time records for cable news recently, and he's right there in the red.
Again, that has to do with the fact that, thank you to Dr. Gamble with 100 bits. Shut up, John. I am very adult. Again, whenever people on the right are like, Fox News is pulling down the highest ratings, whatever. Well, yeah, do you know why that is? Because Fox is the conservative network. It's the right-wing network. So if you're right-wing, what news channel are you watching? Fox News. If you're center, or if you're liberal, what news channel are you watching? You might watch CNN, you might watch NBC, you might watch MSNBC, you might watch ABC News, you might watch, what are the other channels? CBS. The rest of the population is spread out amongst a ton of other channels and networks. Whereas if you're right-wing, there's only one place to go to get your fill of, like, bias-filled opinion on news. That would be why, John. It's this interesting cognitive dissonance, too. Well, people like John and people on the right and people like my dad, who I haven't talked to in a long time, will simultaneously be like, Fox News is the biggest news network in the country. But they're also like, and the mainstream media lies. Well, if Fox News is the biggest news network in the country, isn't that the mainstream media? Well, no, it's not, because MSNBC and CNN and all these other networks exist. It's like, okay. So then Fox being the biggest network doesn't really matter because it's the one and only network on that side of the fence, on the crazy right-wing side. Well, no, but it's still the biggest. So they're the mainstream media. Well, no, because this and the, you know, it's this weird, like, cognitive dissonance where they need both to be right at the same time. RT is off the fucking map. RT is literal Russian propaganda. So, PK the Lost. I love the people who say America first and give Trump handjobs left and right as he takes it up the A from Putin and other foreign leaders.
With the core of Trump's base. This is where we are right now, and we have to capitalize on that. Once we take the culture back, we can debate all the other things. But if we don't use this momentum while we have it, then it will be too late and it won't even matter. And Ben Shapiro even, he just wrote a book talking about some of these things, and he didn't support Trump in 2016, so kind of seems like we're all kind of waking up to the fact that if we have a future, it's going to be with these ideas. So we'll go through these now, but some people are going to be like, well, now wait a minute, why didn't you bring up the Second Amendment or things like that? And it's because those are obvious. Those go without saying. These are intended to redirect the discussion towards the heart of the country and the base. So the first one is simply that the nation contains unique and valuable people, culture, and history that are worthy of preservation.
Sure, all people in all cultures that are worthy of preservation. But if you're going to say that statues are literally culture, and you're going to be like, the Confederacy is part of our culture, well, no, they seceded from the country. and they only lasted 5 years. Friends, the TV show, lasted longer than that. So I'd say that's a bigger part of American culture than the Confederacy was. But, you know, whatever.
A lot of times what we're told is, well, there's no such thing as American culture
Nobody says that.
or American identity. America's a nation of immigrants. There's nothing
Right, which is why people say we're a melting pot. Our culture is a conglomeration of all kinds of different people's cultural traditions, and then they've become sort of different. They've become Americanized, right? Like pizza. This is just a specific example, but like this applies to all sorts of things. An American pizza is very different than if you get a pizza in Italy, right? It's because immigrants came here, started making traditional dishes with ingredients that they had here that maybe they didn't have at home, or they don't have the ones from home here, and then it changes over time and becomes Americanized. This happens with cuisine, it happens with other traditions, it happens with festivals and beliefs and all sorts of things. So, yeah, America has a very interesting mix of culture that creates what is American culture. It includes all sorts of people of all different beliefs and origin points, and pretty interesting.
unique about her. She's just basically an open lobby for every other group of people to occupy. And you can say that they're all unique and that their histories are valuable and that they're entitled to preserve their ways of life. But if you say that about America, it's offensive. It's
No one says that's offensive or racist, John. Stop straw manning.
racist, it's bigoted, it's xenophobic, etc. And no country that hates itself is ever going to survive. So our job is to affirm that no, actually, we're not just a propositional nation built on a handful of good ideas. We're a distinct people with a distinct culture. We have roots that go very deep in this land, and we're pioneers and innovators, and we're moral and
Our roots that go very deep in this land. 200 years?
benevolent people, and we're
It's not that deep, John.
fundamentally good people.
And I'm not even disagreeing. I agree. American culture is a thing. Of course it is. Not only is American culture a thing, I think it's been our most successful export for the last, like, 40, 50 years, you know? So, yes, American culture exists. Everyone recognizes this. And if you find anyone who says otherwise, they're a fringe person. Stone Corbell with 10 bits. I've never heard anyone say there's no such thing as American culture. People say that about white culture, though. Maybe that's what he's dog whistling. Maybe. Because there isn't really white culture. There are different nationalities of white people that came to the United States and then became sort of a conglomerate culture. Germans, like, had a really big influence in certain areas. The French in some areas, especially down south, like in Louisiana, the English, all sorts of different places.
And our culture is unique, and it is good, and our history is important to us. Our forefathers are important to us, and it doesn't matter if our history has some bad things in it. Just
I think you're underplaying. And again, I recognize the good with the bad, but it's not just a few bad things, John. It's like atrocities. Like Holocaust-level atrocities. Like chattel slavery, John? That's, like, awful. That's one of the worst things human beings have ever done to each other. And I know you're going to say, well, actually, did you know that certain groups in Africa were doing slavery before that? Okay, fine. That's bad too, John. What I'm saying is our country propagated this slavery and helped make it the norm for hundreds and hundreds of years. And generations of people were born into bondage with no chance of being able to pursue their own happiness because they were considered the property of others. There are good things about America, but there are also awful, awful things that you need to accept and contend with in regard to America's identity. It's a part of it.
just like every other country's history, by the way, because it's still our history and it has value to us. It turns out that American people and American culture are unique and we're entitled to preserve them. And if you took the population of America and switched it with the population of Latin America, America wouldn't be America anymore. And I'm not saying that there's
Okay, no one's disagreeing with that, weird straw man.
anything necessarily wrong with Latin America. I'm just saying that we're unique and we get to acknowledge that too. And we get to preserve our sovereignty and identity as a country because that's the whole point of having a country. And if you want to attack my character for that, for wanting the same sovereignty that every other country on the face of the
No one's attacking you for wanting sovereignty. America has sovereignty, but the idea of preserving culture makes no sense. Culture changes all the time. No one's trying to take your culture away from you just because it's changing. And I'll even point out, because you're going to do a whataboutism, I'll even point out something else that I think is stupid. France, for instance. France has this same issue where they have this huge focus on preserving their culture, right? So they have, like, French language boards that try and make sure that the French language doesn't change too much because they have this, like, high cultural value on it. They have certain things that, like, more or less try and keep French culture pure, right? I also think that is stupid. No one in the history of humanity has ever successfully put their culture in carbonite. You cannot preserve your culture because culture is not static. It is a living thing. It is constantly changing and moving. You cannot preserve something that doesn't have a static form.
The Earth, and throughout history has wanted, you can get bent. We're done apologizing for our history and for our culture and for our people, and frankly, for all of those being better and more interesting than everyone else's. Like President Trump said, Americanism, not globalism.
Gross. John, you know you can be both, right? You can both be proud of your country, for whatever that means, and say that you love the country in which you live, while also recognizing, hey, we're not the only country on the planet. There are tons of people out there who love their countries, and that's great too. That's fine, right? And they have different ways of doing things, and they might have different values, and we're one country out of many, and we need to work with other people, because we're adults, and we live on a planet with each other, and right now it's the only planet we got. You gotta learn to get along with people.
So the next one is that the government exists to protect its citizens. All government policies, especially on trade, sovereignty, immigration, austerity, and wars, should serve the interests of the people. Literally, the whole reason we have a government is to serve the interests of the American people. That's
Sure.
what they all swear to do, but unfortunately, no one ever got rich shilling for the interests of the American people.
So we should get rid of Citizens United then, right? So that corporations can't dump millions of dollars into political campaigns through PACs and super PACs? Because I'd agree with you if that's the point you're making.
And we can get into the specifics of all the different genres of policy and ascertain what best serves the interests of the American people within those contexts. But to suggest that in any of those contexts, the interests of the American people should be put second to the interests of another country, whether that's out of a misguided sense of moral obligation with things like endless wars in the Middle East or
John, let's be clear here. When people like George W. Bush tried to make a moral argument for why we need to invade the Middle East, he wasn't being genuine. He was not arguing in good faith. He and his buddies wanted to protect oil interests and try and go and steal resources. So when they say, like, we're America, we gotta go police the world, we gotta go and, deliver freedom, that's a lie that they're telling to dumb rubes to try and get them on board with foreign wars that they otherwise wouldn't do. No one genuinely believes that unless they're an idiot. Dr. Gamble with 50 bits. If we got a 51st state, these folks would get butthurt over adding an extra star to the flag because we'd be changing our culture. True.
bankrupting our country to make China wealthier because we think it'll make them embrace democracy.
John, are you stupid? That's not why capitalists have moved for free trade agreements. They did it because it would make them more money. No one genuinely believes, like, oh, if we move jobs over to China, then democracy will suddenly happen and flourish. Capitalists decided that labor costs here got too high because no amount of money is too much for these people. Despite the fact that they were already millionaires and billionaires, they still needed more money, so they said, well, let's do some free trade agreements and we can move our factories to China where we can pay pennies on the dollar for labor. And then we can make even more money. It has nothing to do with people moralizing and saying, we're going to bring democracy to China. No politician, if anyone has ever said that, meant that. This is a capitalism problem, John.
Or even allowing for mass immigration into our country that displaces native-born Americans. These are things...
Displaces native-born Americans? Is the United States a bathtub filled to the brim, where if, like, a Hispanic family jumps in, a bunch of the water that is the white people come out of it? That's not how it works, John.
Things that are not good for American people. And perhaps once we take care of our own people and we take care of our veterans, maybe then we can start worrying about how we can help the rest of the world, which, by the way, we've done more than any other nation in history. But
yes, America, well known for helping the rest of the world, and not at all for getting involved in things we should never have gotten into for our own interests. Absolutely. The entire Cold War, all those proxy wars, those weren't secretly about trying to stop communism. Those were actually about saving people. Genius.
for the time being, it's fair to say that we need to stop allowing our ruling class to sell us out to foreign adversaries. And this is a message that resonates with everyone. It is the most obvious idea.
And yet, you're simping for Donald, I fucking work for Russia Trump. Genius.
In all of political science, a government should exist to serve the interests of its people. And if that government is filled with people who aren't willing to do that and instead opt to sell us out, to pad their own pockets, to live in their gated communities and luxury apartments in downtown Washington, D.C., maybe it's time for those people to be kicked out. And to
Okay, how about this, John? You and I will form a coalition together, and we will work to take private funding out of elections altogether. That way, if someone wants to become a congressperson, whether it be in the Senate or the House of Representatives, then that person has to be doing it for the right reasons and not for that sweet, sweet donor cash. Great. Give me a call, John.
humiliated and perhaps even thrown in prison. Whatever. That brings us to the next one, which is that those in government should live by the same laws of the people they govern. In
Donald Trump, who's broken multiple laws, his campaign managers, all of which have been indicted, some of which he's pardoned? Hello? Hello?
America, we're ostensibly equal under the law, and that not only means that we're treated equally in the sense that the law can't be meaner to me than it is to you, but it also works the other way too. So the law can't be nicer to me than it is to you. And what we've learned throughout the last few decades in American history is that we actually don't live in that society. We live in a society.
Yeah, rich people get to do what they want because they have money. I agree. Excessive wealth and the uncaring attitude towards the poor is a problem. John, the answer isn't more conservatism. Conservatism is how we got this problem in the first place.
With rules for people like you and me, and then a separate set of rules for those who seek to benefit from breaking rules at our expense and for their own interests, and who also have the means of doing so without consequence. And we can tie this to Barack Obama illegally spying on the Trump campaign.
Hey, John, do you think that trying to listen in on the Trump campaign had anything to do with the fact that they probably still are, committing treason by working with a foreign government to subvert an American election? Something that America's intelligence communities have agreed on, and the Senate just released an intelligence report confirming? You idiot. Actually, no, I shouldn't say that. John's not an idiot. He's a fascist, and he knows what he's doing. He's just dishonest.
Clintons, Epstein, etc. Or we can get down to things like rioting and looting, going completely unpunished and even being endorsed by the mainstream narrative. People vandalizing and destroying federal property. But if you and I went out there and did the same thing, except instead of wearing a hoodie and carrying a Desert Eagle because Deadpool has one, and I think comic books are so cool. I love pop culture.
John, you literally, in the beginning of this video, got a boner over giving machine guns to children. So maybe not the hill to die on for you.
My entire purpose is to consume media. Instead of doing that, we've got a plate carrier and an AR-15. We would be lit up like a Christmas.
Dr. Gamble with 20 bits. Oh, wow. A Democrat doing something bad. That never happens with Republicans. You're not going to take the intelligence agency's word for it? Okay, what about the Senate investigation that just got reported? What about the Mueller investigation? Like, really? Dude? What about the fact that Trump has met with Putin in secret multiple times and not allowed anyone in on the meetings, including people who are normally his translators?
Tree. We would be Swiss cheesed. We would be other references to getting shot. Like, you get the point. The difference is that we hypothetically would be acting against the narrative, and that's not allowed, whereas the other people would be acting on behalf of the narrative, and so that's A-okay. Like, there is so much corruption at every level of law in this country.
It's almost like context matters.
The bureaucracy, the administrative state. Trump was so right in describing it as a swamp, because that's what it is. It's a disgusting swamp filled with leeches, parasites with no soul and no integrity, and say what.
Imagine talking about this and having Donald Trump's name still on your tongue and not connecting the two. Donald Trump, good friend of Jeffrey Epstein, who has literally been on record before saying that, boy, Jeffrey Epstein, he likes him younger. I do too. You know, Donald Trump, who just in the past month wished, what's her name, Maxine whatever, Ghislaine, blah blah blah, Jeffrey Epstein's accomplice, wished her well in prison. Really?
What you will about having a king, but at least the odds are a little bit better. Like, in that system, you've got a son who's born into this family, who's been in charge of protecting these people, and maybe you don't want to become a king, but it's your duty, and so you're raised to learn how to be strong and righteous, and you care about the people you govern. Or maybe you end up being a total jerk and they cut your head off. The point is that, at least in that system, the odds seem to be a little bit better. Whereas in our system, since we have democracy and everyone's vote counts, the type of people that are attracted to holding office and the type of people who are successful at obtaining it.
Are you advocating for a monarchy? You and Caitlin from Liberty Hangout should go on a date. I think you'd get along.
Are the absolute scum of society. They're lying, power-hungry sociopaths with no integrity. It is literally...
And yes, as we've seen from history, monarchs are not power-hungry or vindictive whatsoever. What?
Really a matter of wanting power and wealth and then lying to everybody to get it without any regard for anything other than your own greed.
By the way, again, in case anyone in the comments is like, what, since when are you saying John is a fascist? He's literally saying that, like, monarchy is better than democracy. And the modern equivalent of a monarchy would be like a dictatorship. Like North Korea, right? Or Russia.
In your own pride. And this is the case with very few exceptions. So the point is that the American people are sick of having to pay for speeding tickets while we let the ruling class literally get away with murder. I don't want to pay $100 for a ticket from a red light camera if it means that officials from the Obama administration are going to get to cross that same intersection on the way to the jobs that they can still get in Washington. And you wonder why nobody has any faith in the institutions anymore. But anyways, next one is that economic interests should never benefit the few while displacing the many. Now, this is one that might sound like a talking point from AOC. Workers of the world unite.
Yes, unironically, yes.
We will dismantle oppression board by board. But, you know, again, we can get into the specifics of all the different things, but this is largely why Donald Trump won. And this doesn't mean that billionaires shouldn't exist or all companies should be worker cooperatives. See,
billionaires shouldn't exist. All companies should be worker cooperatives, unironically.
CEOs are evil. It just means that the economy of a country exists to benefit the people in that country, not the other way around. We don't work for the economy works for us. And this,
John, that hasn't been the case in decades and decades and decades. You know, in the 50s, the time period that people like you like to fetishize, the highest marginal tax rate at the time was 90%. Taxes on the wealthy were huge back in the day because at that time people recognized at a certain point the wealth that you're accruing isn't helping anyone, not even you. So at a certain point, congrats, you've won capitalism. Good job. Now we're going to take that money and put it back into the system that helped you get where you are as a millionaire or a billionaire. And now it's going to help other people get to where you are. It's reasonable.
This means protecting our manufacturing jobs, our mining industry, our logging industry, and having trade policy that does the same and is actually oriented towards bringing those jobs back and keeping them here because they...
John, the jobs that you're trying to bring back, most of them don't exist anymore. automation is and will continue to be the biggest threat to workers on the planet. And that doesn't mean we should stop automation, because ideally, as a society, if we can move past the need for, like, intensive physical labor to get products made, that's a good thing. We just need to make sure that the benefits of that system don't get funneled to a very few people at the top, which is the system we currently have.
They were sold away to the lowest bidder by these giant corporations, and middle America was hollowed out as a result.
Yes, capitalism has destroyed the economy of middle America. I'm glad you agree, John.
That's why Trump won. He promised to bring those jobs back,
and he hasn't.
I swear to God, if I get one of those libertarian think tank dweebs, like one of those people who just defaults to abstract concepts with no regard for the practicality of the real world, like, I read a book that was written in 1946 about theoretical economics, and Henry Hazlitt says that the money saved by the businesses will be reinvested into the economy, and new jobs will be created, and the products will all be cheaper as a result, so we all get to consume more. Okay. Interesting. Let me digest that. Oh yeah, that just didn't happen. Right, like what you said? Yeah, that went ahead and just didn't happen. He was wrong. The jobs just went away, and the jobs that may have been created as a result are all in the information economy. So your libertarian, free trade, open borders, we're not Americans, just dollar signs, economic policy now has whatever is left of those jobs being competed for by more Americans, and then millions and millions of low-skilled immigrants, but your dad got to pay like $30 less.
How's a low-skilled immigrant gonna come in and work in the information sector, John?
For the TV he gave you for your birthday? What a joke. Let's take a drive sometime through the neighborhoods of Ohio or Pennsylvania, and let's have a kid tell you, oh yeah, my grandpa worked at the factory and he got my dad his job at the factory, but then after it closed, my dad didn't know what to do, so he just sat at home watching a TV from China all day, and then he saw a commercial for this drug that was being mass marketed, and he ended up getting hooked on it and dying from it actually 2 months ago from an overdose. And so now my little sisters and my mom and I don't know what to do. And I want you to look at him.
It's wild to me that he is describing exactly how capitalists have helped destroy American families, destroy the heart of middle America, and his solution is to move further right. It's insanity.
And say, welp, he should have been smarter. Why don't you just leave the graves of your family behind and move to San Francisco and learn to code the American way? No, the American way would be breaking your teeth for saying something like that, and then drinking a whole 2-liter of Mountain Dew and doing a burnout on a dirt bike. The heart of this country isn't in a...
Every once in a while, John says something that reminds me how young he is. And you know what? I'm not even that much older than John, but I'd like to think I have a better handle on my own self-awareness and knowing that I say stupid shit, and knowing that my stupid opinion is not the end-all be-all, whereas John, when he speaks about stuff like this, thinks he's like the next coming of Ronald Reagan, and he's going to lead conservatism into a bright future. Like, it's so insane.
Crowded city, drinking iced coffee and making colorful websites that sexualize children. It's in middle America, and that's who needs our help, and that's why Trump won. And on that note, speaking of taking care of our people, get into the next one, which is just that we should nation build at home, not abroad. Our resources should be going to American people, to American infrastructure, American communities and cities, and once that's taken care of, we can start building for other countries. And only after that, after we've taken care of our own people, can we start to send billions of dollars in foreign aid to other countries? Can we spend billions of dollars sending troops to provide security for these countries that give us nothing in return? There's no reason to take money and young men away from American homes and then just throw them at other countries just to see what the heck happens.
It's not to see what the heck happens, John. The reason that we get so involved in the Middle East is twofold. Firstly, for economic reasons, because rich people in this country want to make sure that that region of the world is favorable to them in regard to getting things like oil. Secondly, we have a real buddy-buddy relationship with Israel, right? So we go back to them way more often than we should. It's pretty simple.
Other than if you were maliciously profiting from it. We come first. American people come first. Our prosperity is prioritized. And that brings us to the next one, which is just that law and order are the cornerstones of prosperity. And that just means that in order to have a prosperous society, you have to have a stable society.
Law and order, like commuting the sentence of Roger Stone.
You must have law and order. You cannot have chaos. You cannot have rioting and looting. And no society obviously is ever going to be completely peaceful, but you have to have stability. The people have to know that if they choose to create chaos, they will face consequences. And right now, people don't know that because they've been allowed to get away with it, or at least,
Oh boy, John, what are you going to advocate for here?
the people on the left have. And when that happens, businesses close, people move out, property values drop, people lose money and savings, livelihoods are destroyed. They can't coexist. Chaos is not conducive to prosperity, and it should be met with the full force of our law enforcement with no exception. And some people...
Can you define full force? Because a lot of police departments in this country have military surplus vehicles and actual, automatic weapons. So you're gonna have to be more specific, John.
People don't get that. They're like, well, bro, what are you, a bootlicker? You want police to stop rioters from destroying local businesses? Okay, bro, have fun licking boots. And it's like, no, but if you don't let the police do their jobs, then the rioters are...
You gotta let the police do their jobs. And by their jobs, I mean, if they kill black people extrajudicially, then great. No, John, for one thing, most of the protests have been peaceful. The big thing a lot of you people on the right, talking point, by the way, it's like, oh my god, an AutoZone got burned to the ground, and then that guy got caught, and it turned out he's affiliated with a white supremacist group who was trying to make the protesters look bad. So maybe stop trying to frame the issue in such a way that isn't congruent with reality. That'd be great.
are just going to pull you out of your car and punch your head like frickin' Randy Orton, which literally just happened the other night. And from what I know, the guy still hasn't regained consciousness because his head smacked into the pavement and bounced.
Hey, how about, John, how about this then? Just a question. Cop pushing old man. Talking about someone smacking into the pavement. Remember this, John? Remember when this was happening and this guy's just standing here? And the cops push him over and his head smacks the pavement and blood is literally pouring out of his ear. And they all walk over him. And then they arrest this guy who's just being like, what the fuck, guys? Because we can do this all day, John. I guarantee I can find more videoed evidence of cops hurting people unnecessarily than you can find of protesters being violent.
And of course, the media have completely refused to cover it. And that brings us to the next one, which is just that the media more often than not distort the truth and divide countrymen. We like to think of the media and journalism almost like...
Of course, except for things like Breitbart and Fox News, though. They're always honest.
This noble profession, people working real hard to get the scoop, to break the big stories, the big exposés, but that's just not the case anymore. These people are activists. They don't even pretend...
CNN is corporate media, John. I agree. Corporate media is bad and biased, and their bias is usually in favor of capitalism. It's in favor of really not questioning power structures in our society and advocating for very liberal positions like, oh, we'll do a bunch of symbolic stuff, but we won't actively work to change systematic issues at a policy-making level. Right? It's a lot of show, not do. So I would agree, but for entirely different reasons than you think they're bad. Fox News is way worse at this. If you think Fox News is not also on the same page as CNN in regard to tailoring their stories to fit a narrative and to try and push people towards a certain ideology, you're delusional or you're lying.
to be objective anymore.
Marvel Lafayette. Marvel Lafayette. 100 bits. Amazing lipstick. Thank you.
For the most part. They've become celebrities. They are making tens of millions of dollars between speaking fees, book deals, public appearances, etc. And so we have to seriously wake up to the fact that the fake news media is literally profiting.
Fake news. Lugenpressen. As, some people in Germany a long time ago used to say.
off the division of the American people, and perhaps we should start to consider how long we're going to allow that to happen. Here's a thought experiment. We all know that we have freedom of speech, but we also know that there are limitations. For example, if you and I went into a crowded theater and we yelled fire when there was no fire, we would be punished because that could incite chaos. Now, apply that principle on the macro scale. When people are deliberately spreading lies to the American people about systemic racism, racist police.
Here's the thing, though, John. For one thing, we had this thing in the country a while back. It was called the Fairness Doctrine. It basically said that any news programming anywhere that was broadcast had to adhere to a policy of being neutral on issues. But what do you know? Your buddy Ronnie Reagan came along, and he said, you know what? Let's get away with this. Let's do away with this. And it was, weakened supremely. And then I think Bill Clinton came along on the 90s, again, being this neo-lib piece of crap, and he also got away with it, did away with it. So now we have things like Fox News, or things like CNN, making ridiculous, like, how do I put this? Clickbaity is how I would describe CNN a lot of the time, because they're this big corporate media thing. Bad. It's all bad, John. So if you'd like to redo the Fairness Doctrine, that's fine. But if your example is, they're saying systematic racism is a thing, and I don't think it is, just disagreeing with the news is not them lying. You can't use that as a measuring stick as to whether or not a news station is lying, because that's not a lie. It also comes to the issue of, who is going to decide what is true, right? Who's going to decide what is true in terms of news reporting and how they report it? Is it going to be based on the whims of whoever's president at the time and their administration? Is it going to be part of the executive branch? Is there going to be some new branch of government, basically a ministry of truth, that's going to try and look at every news broadcast, and whoever's in charge of it is going to dictate what is and is not okay to say on the news? Questionable, to say the least. It's why we already have things like libel and slander laws, right? But, I don't know. That's a bigger issue, and using the examples that you have used tell me that you are going into this not in a genuine way of trying to say that, oh, I have certain issues with the news media, but I have issue with left-leaning news media. I agree that the corporate news media in this country, everything from MSNBC to Fox News, these things have systematic issues that involve being very sensational and chasing stories that fit a certain narrative. But at the end of the day, what is your solution, John? Because there isn't a clear one, other than maybe trying to get certain money out of it, and you can't because they're private corporations, or literally making them act like AP News, right? And just be, here are the facts, there's no more news commentary, it doesn't exist anymore, here are the facts of the story, make your own opinion. Mike Marshall illustration is followed, but bear in mind that will also destroy Fox News, because the entirety of their business model is, here's a little story, here's us talking about it for 48 hours, and trying to tell you why this is the liberals' fault. So, just bear it in mind.
Killing black people for absolutely no reason. Donald Trump is killing children at the southern border. America was built on racism. All white people are inherently racist. And then, as a result of that rhetoric, the country lights on fire.
I've never heard a single CNN news anchor say something to the effect of all white people are racist. Or that America's evil, for that matter. No corporate media has ever said America is evil. John, what people want you to do is just to recognize that America is complicated and has done a lot of awful things. I'm not telling you to hate America because of that. I'm telling you to recognize reality and take it into consideration when you're thinking about the country. I know that gets in the way of your jingoistic rah-rah, USA, USA, we're the best country in the world rhetoric, but that's good, because it makes you face reality. And if reality, as it exists, tells you, maybe we're not the greatest country in the history of the world, maybe we're just another country that's gotten very powerful and we have a complicated history like all countries, good. That's more in line with reality than what you were thinking prior,
Lives are lost, livelihoods are destroyed, and there is no accountability, not from those who committed the acts, nor from those who intentionally gave them the demonstrably false information which compelled them to do so. So tell me, is that freedom of speech? Is that what the Founding Fathers intended? I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to deliberately spread information to destabilize the country so you...
Again, you're framing the fact that they're talking about systematic racism as spreading misinformation to destabilize the country. John, I went over your video where you're talking about how you think systematic racism is untrue, and what you said is untrue. You pulled a bunch of cherry-picked statistics and completely misinterpreted some other things, while also ignoring what people who have lived experience have been telling us for decades. So, what's to stop me, for instance, let's say there was a board, and they not only policed, I don't know, CNN and Fox News and MSNBC, but YouTube news outlets, people who talk about politics like you or I. What's going to stop them from, like, tearing you down, right? This is why this is a complicated issue. And you can't just paint it like, I don't like CNN and MSNBC, and I disagree with some of the things they say, therefore, they don't deserve to exist. Like, okay, but that's, like, your subjective viewpoint. That's not something that you can apply evenly. Thank you to Peter Redwood for following.
When your friends can profit from it. And to anyone who's like, oh, but big government, you're going to get big government anyways if you don't hold these people accountable. What do you think happens to a completely destabilized country? Do you think it just remains that way? No. Big government comes to fill the vacuum. So we really have to start to think about these things and not just default to abstractions. And speaking of big government, the next one is that no industry, including technology, should have more power than the state. Now, we hear this and we're skeptical because we hear state and we hear power and we immediately think George Orwell. But all this means is that power can be used against people to infringe upon their rights and exploit them. We know this. This is why we're skeptical of government. But that being said, tyranny is not reserved only for government. You can have tyranny from private actors. Just look at big tech.
Right. So, regulations need to be put in place to keep corporations from exploiting both their workers and the population at large. I agree.
And so what this means is that if there are going to be competing interests in society and competing powers in society, then the one that should have the most power is the one that was established, at least in theory, to serve the people. And the reason for that is that it is easier to hold an establishment like that accountable for wrongdoings since it's in clear violation of its purpose. And also that it's the only establishment that could ever hold the other establishments accountable since it's the law. And you might roll your eyes at this and think, well, the government's never held accountable. Sure, but how do you expect to hold Twitter or Facebook censoring speech accountable?
Just don't use it. If you don't like it, don't use it, John.
If not with the government.
And hey, I'm all for breaking up big tech conglomerates, but at the end of the day, they're also private companies, even if they were smaller. Let's say you broke up Twitter and it somehow became, 30 different Twitters, which wouldn't make any sense. But, let's just use that as an example. I don't even know how you think you would break up Twitter, because it's just a company that owns Twitter. It's not like it's Bell that owns all these different, telephone companies, and you're going to break it up into a bunch of smaller ones. How is that going to work with something like Twitter or Facebook? Facebook you could break up because they own a lot of other stuff. They have their fingers in, Oculus Rift and all sorts of other things. You could break them up. You could break Google up because they own, the search engine and YouTube, and I think they own a cell phone network, and they own, Gmail and all sorts of different things. You could break those things up into separate companies. But something like Twitter owns Twitter. Twitter runs Twitter. That's their business model, right? And on their platform, they can decide what the policies are for people to take part in that private platform. So what are you going to do, John? Because even if you somehow split Twitter up into 30 smaller Twitters, each Twitter would still have policies that might seem unfair to you because they don't allow certain things that you think are okay. Like racism, or spreading misinformation about Black Lives Matter. I don't understand your endgame in regard to this.
What about companies mass marketing drugs to profit off getting Americans addicted? The point...
Right. For-profit healthcare is bad. I agree. So get on the left, John, and advocate for positions that will stop the profiteering off of sick people and the vulnerable.
Is that if you allow these competing interests to have the most power in society...
Pizza is my dad. Thank you for subscribing.
society, then not only are they going to infringe upon your rights just like the big government would, but they're also going to have enough power to buy off the government from ever holding them accountable, which is basically what we've seen for the last few decades. So the reason we want the state to have the most power isn't because we want there to be like these huge amounts of power over us in general, but rather because at least we can theoretically vote people out and we can hold the people accountable like with the state.
You literally were advocating for monarchy like 5 minutes ago.
But we can't do the same with Google. And the only entity that could ever hold these companies accountable would be the state. And if Google has power over the state, then no one's going to help you. So the last one is the preservation and prosperity of the family should be the main priority of government.
Why? Why? Where in the Constitution does it say the government is here and what we are going to do is preserve the nuclear family? No, that's not the role of government. That's way too much government interference. The government has no right to go into people's private lives and say, you know what would be good for you? If you performed cis heteronormativity for us, would you do that? That'd be great. Not cool.
We talk a lot about this on the channel. We know that government's purpose is to serve the society, and society is just comprised of families, and the health of the nation is entirely...
Society is comprised of individuals, some of which live in families, but not everyone.
Contingent upon the health of the family unit. So if we want to build a strong, moral, prosperous, and free society, then we...
Moral? I'd love to see your objective, logical, right-wing citation for the morality involved in being a nuclear family as opposed to some other thing.
We have to orient the administration of that society towards serving the family and doing what is best for the family, not arbitrary groups like black people, gay people, women, immigrants, all the categories.
Oh, so those are arbitrary groups, but a nuclear family is not an arbitrary group. Don't you think that's kind of hypocritical? Because it's arbitrary. Many societies have not functioned in that nuclear family model, right? That's sort of a American 1950s thing, this idea of the white picket fence, your house in the suburbs, a man, a wife, 2 kids. This is not some universal thing.
That the left likes to use, just simply families. That is the priority, and if we did that, literally all the problems that we face as a country would decrease.
What does that even mean? John, there's only 30 seconds left in this video. You can't just be like, we need to prioritize families. Because if you say that with no further explanation, all I'm going to assume is that you're dog whistling that you want to make it illegal for people to be gay, or you make it illegal for, like, women to go and have jobs, so instead they can stay at home and either birth children or clean the house for their man. Like, what do you mean by this, John? Again, when people are like, well, why do you say John's fascist? It's because he does this shit. He knows that he would be embarrassed to say what he really means, so he just kind of dog whistles it. He's like, oh, we should focus on family. Picture of white nuclear family. John, how about, like, families that include 2 dads? That's also a family, right? 2 moms? That's a family. Single moms? That's a family. Larger families that maybe live together? That's a family. What do you mean by family, John? Can you be more specific?
By north of 40%, roughly speaking, within...
Sounds like you already know what he means. Oh, of course I do. Of course I know what he means.
About 2 decades. Hey guys, if you like this video, give it a...
Yikerinos, John. Awful as always.